Hello everybody, my name is Teangi Brown and I'm the Aboriginal Learning Facilitator at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and we're actually here today in the parrawa exhibition, which is a gallery or exhibition that's about the conflict of the Frontier War, or what is known as the Black War of Van Diemen's Land. And we're just going to do an intro and kind of an introduction to the exhibition and how you would go about looking at it. Just to the right here, I actually have Manalagana, who's my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and he's right here at the beginning of this exhibition as one of the first things you see as you make your way into the gallery, because he was here throughout that real conflict over 2 centuries ago. He was here as a part of that story. He got to be living on Van Diemen's Land, on his own country, before settlement, throughout settlement or invasion, and then at the end of it. He was actually removed off country and then to the prison on Flinders Island. So he was a part of this whole story, and that's why he's at the very, very beginning of the exhibition. Now, just because I want to put this into light, this here is just a map of the traditional nations of what we're referring to, what used to be before colonisation occurred or settlement occurred. So these are the 9 nations of Tasmania, or the name in the language we use today, Palawakani, is Luchuwita. So you can see there were 9 different colours. There's actually 48 different dots or clans. That's what those dots represent, clans who managed each one of the regions that they lived within. And there were around about 12 to 14 languages would have been spoken at this time. So I like to show this just to give the understanding, the concept that we had our own names, and I prefer to call these nations quite literally First Nations over the term Aboriginal nations, because as a historical educator, I quite understand a lot of the terms and a lot of the discrimination and a lot of the misunderstanding that's associated with Aboriginal. So I personally don't use that word because I know that it's Latin, and it is a label that was in fact put on to an entire continent of highly diverse peoples. As you can see here, this is the First Nations map of what we now call Australia. And every single colour and shape you see, each people would have spoke a different language, lived in a different region, and so they're shaped by where they live in. This helps to show you just how diverse First Nations Australians are, because everybody's shaped by their environment, and every single environment on this map is completely, utterly different. So all the people would have been unique and different depending on the region you live within. And that's why I don't like the word Aboriginal, because it simplifies us into one whole continent of people when we were very diverse. That's why I like to show people that. Now, the title of the exhibition, Our Land, Parrawa Go Away, was actually stated by an Aboriginal man who could speak English up near Bothwell, which is just out of Hobart, about an hour's drive out of Hobart. And it was stated because it's a perspective that Aboriginal people had. They didn't not want the Europeans to be here, but we kept it as the title because it's also how European people felt when they came here as well. They didn't want Aboriginal people to be here either. So that's why it's Parrawa, go away, because neither peoples wanted each other to be here. They wanted the land for themselves. So this section of the gallery we're about to go through is about that use of the land and about that early interaction, or the point of contact, conflicts and interactions that would have occurred. One of the most kind of fraught and kind of talked about people is Kikitapula, because he had a very, very trying life. From a very, very small boy, he was taken away from his country, from his people. And that was actually on the east coast of Tasmania, the place known as Maria Island. The traditional name for that is Wukuluwikiwana, and he was taken away from there as a little boy, brought down to Hobart town, and actually given into the foster care system. And he was taken in by Sarah and Tom Birch. And he gets known as Black Tom himself, or Tom Birch as well. Now, he lived a very, very hard life because he was taken around at the age of 10, and he lived until about 22 with his European parents, with his family. He was taught English, he could speak, and he could read and write. But one of the most important things that kind of occurred was he was actually baptised as a Christian. So then when he ran away from his European family and joined up with Aboriginal resistance fighters in the time of the war and the conflict, and he would be captured, he would actually be released because he had rights underneath British law as a Christian or baptised person. And he could actually, imagine it, just imagine like you're out there doing hunting parties, and all of a sudden a black man says to you in perfect English, hey, you can't do that to me. You know, I have rights. You got to think about just how unique this would have been, this understanding that this man would have had in this time of history. And unfortunately, this is the only image we have of him. And he lived with Europeans for 12 years, and nobody ever drew him better than this. So it's actually one of those unfortunate stories where we don't know more about him, because he's just a very special person. Now, it's very, very faint, but on this wall here, and just on the other wall, we actually have two films which are giving the perspective of the way each other saw each other right at the very point of contact. For example, this film is an Aboriginal person's perspective of sitting on the beaches and watching the ships go past. And then it's got the dates of all the different explorers and all the different people who came to Van Diemen's Land and then left. And the film that's on that side, which is giving the European perspective, is as if you were sitting on the ships going past Van Diemen's Land, looking out of a telescope and looking in and seeing that there were fires and seeing that there were campfires, there were plumes of smoke. So it's a comparison perspective of what each other saw when they met each other at the beginning. And there's something to always remember when talking about history, is that it is just a story, and that things do get misunderstood. And this is a perfect example here, because this is about the first contact, about how the first contact was a misunderstanding, unfortunately, and that there was a death of a Tasmanian Aboriginal person that occurred. And it occurred because it was actually a French expedition called Marion de Fresnay's expedition, and he came to Marion Bay on the east coast of Tasmania, and just around from Marion Bay is a bay called North Bay. And two longboats came in, and they rowed in, and they tried to communicate with the old people, with traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal people on the beach. And they couldn't really do it all that well. They were trying to mime to each other to communicate. A third longboat came in, and it made the old people uncomfortable. And so they started throwing rocks and spears to tell them, you know, get away from us a bit. We're not comfortable with how close you are. And somebody stood up and shot a musket, and that there then killed one of the old people. And that's known as the first kind of conflict or first death of a Tasmanian Aboriginal person from a European. But it came from a misunderstanding because of the fact that they couldn't communicate and couldn't talk properly. And particularly this piece of art here, I like to point out that this piece of art is quite simply a piece of propaganda, because the event that we're talking about, the Marion de Fresnay event, happened in 1772. And the art that is drawn about that event is done in 1931. And this is an example of what you might find a lot when you look at colonial era art, is you might find the art is drawn about an event that happened 60 years earlier or 100 years earlier. It is just about creating a story, or it's a good imagery. That's something that we must remember when talking about history. This is another one once again. This is a 1803 event, and the art for it is done in 1860. This is a common occurrence that you'll find in colonial era art. There was an exhibition a couple of years ago which pointed this out quite succinctly, that there's almost no imagery for the colonial violence that occurred within Tasmania or within Van Diemen's Land, which is quite surprising considering Van Diemen's Land is known as one of the most brutal places for frontier violence in the entire continent of Australia. So within this case here, we have objects that relate to the Risdon Cove site and what occurred there, the history. And actually we have objects that are on both sides of the kind of history, both sides of the story. So we have Aboriginal stone tool artefacts that were dug out of the site, and then here we have European colonial artefacts of the time. So we have, you know, some colonial nails, a plate, a brick, a little domino, a little toy soldier. So this is just a comparison and talking about the use of the site, and that both histories are combined within it. And that's kind of the nicer side of it compared to this one here, which talks more about the conflict version of what occurred at the Risdon Cove site. So here we have musket balls, we have pistol shot, we have bird shot, we have a cannonball, and that's the flint right here, which is used to make a spark so you can actually shoot your musket. And these kind of ring to the fact that some fighting did happen, some form of violence did occur here. And it is quite contentious because some people will say it was a huge massacre site where Aboriginal people passed away. Up to 50 Aboriginal people passed away here in a conflict. And it's one of those things that it's so hard to be able to prove or have any evidence for. And it's a very, very contentious thing in history. But that's why we talk about this section here, to talk about the conflict and to talk about the horrible thing that occurred, because what was meant to have occurred here was a misunderstanding. The old people were doing their seasonal hunts where they were driving a huge mob of roo down to into the creek system. So you drive them up against the river, so then you can spear a big bunch, so then the whole mob can have a huge big feast. And when that was occurring, the British officers and soldiers and convicts who'd made the settlement right near that river had risen, had thought they were being attacked, and so they opened fire. So it's meant to be, once again, something that happened due to a misunderstanding, due to the fact that people couldn't communicate properly and didn't speak the same language. At least very, very early on, that's what was occurring. But remember, this is history, so it's one of those things that we don't entirely know the ins and outs of it. You've always got to take history with a grain of salt. That's something I've learnt over the years. Now, this story here is one of those very saddening stories, because after the massacre or the conflict, they found a little boy, like a toddler, wandering, an Aboriginal toddler, wandering around in the bush, the British did. And they took him in. But the governor said, please don't take him, actually give him back to his people. But they took him, and it was actually given to the priest, or the Reverend Nopwood of Hobart. And this little boy was called, Robert Hobart May. Robert after Robert Nopwood, Hobart after Hobart Town, and May because that was the month that they found the little boy. And it's kind of quite sad because he disappears entirely from history. The first child to be stolen by the church, and then he completely disappears entirely from the history, and we don't know actually what occurred to this little boy. But quite a few things started at the Risdon Cove site, the first conflict, the first stealing of children. And one of the sadder things is the beginning of human remains being interested in a scientific manner, because that's what this barrel represents here. And it's one of those things where we've got to be very, very correct on it, because circumstances suggest that yes, like the story was written, because the story goes that the surgeon over at Risdon Cove wrote a letter to the surgeon at Hobart stating, would you be able to assist me with the stripping of the flesh off the bones of these two Aboriginal bodies we have, so then we can send them in a barrel back to London for study. Now, he wrote that letter, but we never saw a letter stating, oh yes, we've done it, we've put the bodies in the barrel and it's sent off. So we don't know whether it was done, but circumstances suggest that it was. And the reason for this is because of that time in the sciences and the human sciences, they were figuring out the scale of human evolution, and our whole body parts were seen as highly prized scientific material. They were, and unfortunately, Tasmanian Aboriginal people became one of the highest traded human beings following after this. In the following 3 decades and further decades following from this, we became highly traded. But this here is just an instance of the possibility of the very, very beginning. And circumstances suggest it did happen, but we do not know for certainty. And I'm saying this because it's a very contentious history. This very, very section here is still talked about today, still discussed about, still written about today. So you've got to talk in a very certain way about it. One of the positives, because not many can be taken away, but one of the positives is this. There's actually something known as a fragile peace that did occur between some of the early settlers and the old people. And you can actually see where this man's hunting with a dog. And that's because we traded wallaby fur and kangaroo fur to the early settlers so they could survive by being warm with skins that could deal with these conditions. And then we had dogs for hunting, we did. And that's why it says there was a fragile peace. As a part of that agreement as well, they also traded glass with us. So down here we have glass tools that the old people created after they'd traded meat and furs with settlers, with early settlers. And probably the most fantastic story that I love to talk about here, just because it shows you the human side of things, is actually here. And it just talks about how there was a fire that happened in the European homestead, and some of the old people got into a big line and started passing water to throw it onto the homestead to put it out. And they put the fire out for these people. And simply the reason why they did it is they were human beings who saw other human beings who needed help, and they helped them. And now it goes one way, but when we get to this other side, you're going to see that it unfortunately doesn't go the other way. the people who came here didn't really perceive us as human beings, didn't really perceive the old people as human beings. And you'll see in a lot of the content and the way people wrote about us that quite a few people of the early colony did not think that highly of Aboriginal people. And if you look behind me here, we've got a very, very peaceful kind of scenery, just showing you how peaceful it was, that point of contact. And then there's a black line through the gallery, which is this here. And then the fire represents the fighting, represents the conflict. So in this section of the exhibition, it talks particularly about the conflict known as the Black War. And not even necessarily the Black War itself, but the Black War period, which is known as the decade that surrounds the Black War. And the Black War was actually from 1828 to 1832, and the Black War period can kind of be accepted to be around the early 20s to 1832, or pretty much that 10-year decade. And that's the Black War period. Because I say that because the conflicts really ramped up before the Black War got underway. Now, this here is a representation of that understanding of the conflict of land. And we've got to think of it through this lens of why are wars fought today? They're fought for the same reason they've always been fought for throughout all of history. They're fought for land and resources. The war in Tasmania, the war in Van Diemen's Land was fought over the exact same thing. So in this instance here, we have European farmers going out, putting up fences, taking over traditional hunting grounds and putting down sheep. And then Aboriginal people, or the First Nations old people, going to their old hunting grounds and then going, oh, what's here? What's all these white creatures and all these fences? And using fire, hence why we have the fire to represent this, they burn down farms, burn down fences, and spear thousands of sheep and try and drive people off their land because they were being encroached upon. But on the flip side, we've got to understand that the people who came here, they knew how to do warfare. They'd been doing warfare for a very, very long time, the British Empire had. They knew how to fight. And one of the things that was done early on was the attacking of the food pyramid, essentially, the food chain. Is they went out and they shoot as many kangaroos and wallabies as possible, both for their own meat, so they can store it, and for their own leather, for all the convicts. So the convicts had nice leather clothes and leather boots, all made from kangaroo and wallaby. It also meant that all those Aboriginal people couldn't eat, and if you can't eat, you can't fight. An army and war runs on the stomach. It does. And once they attacked our food supplies, then you can see it became much, much harder to actually fight back and to be resistance, or to cause resistance against settlement. It's something that quite often people forget. And if you remember it in this case, with this image here, it is that throughout history, I remember when I was in school, for example, we learnt that pretty much history is a series of conflicts going over thousands of years, on and on and on and on. And that's history as we know it. That's European and Asian history as we know it, Middle Eastern as well. Now, in the instance of Australia, we actually have a continent where mass genocide and the stealing of one's land and country is not done, because it's actually against our culture. If you've ever talked to an Aboriginal person, we'll say this: the earth is our mother, and that we were given a task to look after and care for the country that we stand upon from the creation spirits. And every single First Nations person who lives on their own country was given that same task. So rule number one is you don't invade another person and take their country, because they're caring for it because it was given to them from the beginning of time by the creation spirits as their task to care for. So it was rule number one: you don't invade somebody and take their land. And that's why the continent of Australia looks so diverse, and that's why we can prove that we've lived in one place for 40,000 years, because there was no mass genocides and invasions within our own peoples. We didn't do it. It's against our understanding of balance and harmony with Mother Earth and nature. We had conflicts and we fought. We're human, that's obvious, but we didn't have mass genocides and mass warfare the way human beings did in a lot of other parts of the world. Now, I really like to show this because it's a bit of art, and so few people actually see this in the exhibition. And that is, there's actually a face here. This is the face of Governor Arthur, and this is the face of Truganini. And the reason why we have this is the two kind of most well-known public figures, Truganini on the First Nations on the Aboriginal side, and then Governor Arthur on the European, the colonial, the British side, facing each other off. With a quote here: "We would suggest that a reward be offered for the apprehension, so the arrest of Black Tom, Kikitapulla, the man I mentioned before. that he'd be immediately gibbeted. So that means to be hanged by the neck on the very spot which has been the scene of his atrocities. And this was done by the colonial times. And we've got to remember, this is perspective, as is all things in life. You know, they were saying he was doing atrocities. Now, think of it from his perspective. He was stolen at the age of 10 or so. He's forced to live with Europeans all of his life, then he runs away and rejoins Aboriginal people. And so from his perspective, he's probably going, oh, I'm saving my own people from the atrocities of the Europeans that have come. This is a matter of perspective. It also could be perceived as propaganda, and we've got to remember this. That's what a lot of history is. Now this is quite a sad story, and it just talks about the first execution that occurred within Melbourne, in fact, or the colony in Victoria. And it was actually these two men here, Tama Minaway and Mawabaina. And this is the way the story goes, is that a delegation of Aboriginal people from Tasmania went across to Victoria with George Augustus Robinson when he was setting up his missions in Victoria. And they went over there with him because he assumed that, you know, all Aboriginal people can communicate with each other, which we obviously can't. Tasmanian Aboriginal people have been separated from the mainland for 15,000 years. And then when we got up there and we couldn't communicate, he just essentially abandoned the old people from Tasmania. And the way the story goes is they saw a man, a sealer, who'd done a horrible thing to one of the women in their group a few decades earlier. And these two men then went and killed that man in retribution. They were then the first two people to ever be executed officially by the government in Victoria. And I've read the transcripts, and it's a horrible occurrence. Everybody who watched it stated, we regretted watching it because each person hung for over 5 minutes, which is just a horrible thing to think about. And they actually destroyed the gibbet that they built for that day and spent the next week or so building another one for all future executions. On the 20th of March, on the 20th of January, every single year, there's a march down the middle of Melbourne, down the street of Melbourne, in honour of these two men and what occurred. There is. And there's, I think, even a memorial there now too. Now, I like to show people this image because it actually gives you the understanding of where this building used to be and how it's situated into the environment around it. So that window there is, in fact, if we just look to our right, the window directly over there near the fire. So we're actually standing up on the top of this building, we are. And when you look at this, you can see how it used to be situated. Outside of the museum where the car park is, that's actually where the water used to be. And our basement used to actually be the ground level, but it's gone underground. It's slowly sunk underground across the last 2 centuries. It has. And the title of this is The Engine Room of the Invasion. And it's titled that because out of this building, the musket balls, the clothes, the rations, the boots for the soldiers and for the settlers to fight the war and just to settle the colony were kept in this building and were kept in these rooms. Because this is the bond store where all the bonded goods were kept before they went out to the settlers. So yeah, in a way, this is the engine room of the invasion of Van Diemen's Land. So I don't often actually get to talk to this image, but it's an image that kind of has an interesting story behind it, in that if you look at it, it's one European man surrounded by Aboriginal people. And this was actually painted from a letter. So it was a letter that was written in Van Diemen's Land, then sent to London, and then it was drawn from that. That's why if you look at some of the imagery, even the trees don't look like they're from Tasmania. It looks like palm trees up here. This is propaganda once again, this is. And it's actually considered, and I've seen this in a separate exhibition, where it was considered the only time where there was kinda ever a conflict actually drawn or painted about the conflict that happened in Van Diemen's Land. And I consider it not true, and quite a few people who I've spoken to have said it looks like a bit of a farce. It does. One man defending from 15 to 20 different Aboriginal people. It almost sounds like oh no, we're being attacked in our colony, please come and help us. Send more help to the end of the world, to Van Diemen's Land. That's, in a way, you can perceive this here. So this part is actually quite contentious because these are physical objects that were here part of the Black War, or part of the Van Diemen's Land conflict. In fact, that brown vest there, and these spears and the little spear here are all associated with conflicts and with fighting. So they're real objects that have got this real story attached to them. But it's good to talk about the kind of a few of the tactics that occurred. So, for example, the brown vest musket had to be reloaded by, you have your musket, you'd stamp it down in the end of the barrel. That roundabout takes a minute or so if you're really good at reloading. And the old people, traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal people, figured this out relatively early on in their conflicts with settlers and with soldiers, is that if you kind of goaded or tricked the person you're fighting to shoot prematurely, then you knew, okay, I have 1 minute before they're going to be reloaded, and that's the time they would come in and fight with hand-to-hand combat, whether it be with a waddy or whether it be a short spear. So the tactics were kind of developed to fight against each other. A comparison to that is, for example, a lot of the fights that occurred is Europeans would only be able to find Aboriginal people when we were asleep around our campfires. And so they'd wait early in the morning to look where the light from the fire was reflecting on the treetops and sneak in and surround campfires and attack Aboriginal people like that. Then the old people, they would do a lot of their attacks of a daytime. In the middle of the daytime, they would do attacks on homesteads. So they almost fought in a completely opposite way. They did. It was quite an interesting kind of way to look at it, their tactics are. This particularly very, very long spear is very, very special. And we've even had a researcher almost 5 years ago now, measure this spear and state it's quite possibly one of the longest throwing spears ever seen. She'd ever seen anywhere on Earth. And it's actually 6 meters long. And I've held it in my hand, and it's a very powerful spear to feel, because it's got that history. It's from almost 2 centuries ago. And then we have the short stabbing spear here, which is a very interesting spear because it has that story of it actually was gathered and taken out of the body of a farmer on the east coast of Tasmania. So it's a very kind of powerful object, and it has that story of it's taken somebody's life. And so that's why it's here in the conflict gallery, or in the Black War gallery. It's very powerful. It is. And if we just looked over here, this is a artistic installation made by Julie Goff, who's a very well-known Tasmanian Aboriginal artist today. And what she did is she got the images from the Proclamation Board, which the Proclamation Board was a kind of essentially a poster that the British Empire or the British government of the time in Van Diemen's Land created to try and stop the conflict, or to try and shape the conflict to go down a certain pathway. And Julie has taken those images and put them into a shadow puppet form, and then made a kind of puppet show telling the story of the Proclamation Board here, and putting it inside one of the colonial British army tents of the time, the tents that they would have been using in the time of the Black Line, in the time of the Black War. So it's kind of very layered and symbolic. It is. Now, the space I'm standing in, and this is really for when you do get to come to TMAG after after Corona, once everything's kind of opened up a bit, and we had this exhibition ready for people to come in to see. Here we actually have 2 films. On this side, it's the perspective of First Nations people or Aboriginal people, and on this side we have the perspective of the European colonial settlers. And we show kind of each or every single event that occurred, and we show the perspectives of each side. So this is how the Europeans perceived the event that occurred, and this is how Aboriginal people perceived it, of the exact same event. And so it's a good way to kind of just to see how people perceive this history on both sides, which is never talked about. For example, I learnt almost my entire education system within the state of Tasmania, and I did not learn all that much about the history of Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land. I learnt more walking around this room once than my entire 12 years within school. So you'll see I'm kind of standing in a mock forest, and there's a reason for this. You'll notice the Proclamation Boards nailed onto the trees, because this is kind of what was done. In the colonial era, early British authorities nailed these posters, essentially, or the Proclamation Board, outside of settled districts. And it was meant to tell Aboriginal people a story. They were meant to look at this and go, oh, so this is meant to be about coming together and living in harmony. But to do that, we're going to have an agreement. Because if you look at it, if you look at this, it can be really quite confusing, even for us today. Imagine it was 2 centuries ago and there were 9 nations, 48 different clans, and there were 14 languages spoken, none of them being English. How do you think we would be able to perceive this when our art wasn't even like that? People of today have issues with understanding this. So I can imagine 2 centuries ago, the old people, traditional Aboriginal people, would have quite a few issues. The way we can break it down is we must live together in peace and harmony, and to do that, we must come to an agreement. And then the last 2 are about punishment, they are. And I'll actually show you up here the way that looks. So if an Aboriginal man spears a European man, that Aboriginal person would be, executed. If a European man shot an Aboriginal man, that European would be executed. Now this was stated on the boards to say this is justice. If this occurs, this will occur. Now, it may have been stated, but in fact, there's no instance of that. There's not one recorded instance of a British person being, in fact, executed or punished for the death of a Tasmanian Aboriginal person throughout the conflict. And there's only one instance of anybody ever being punished for a crime against a Tasmanian Aboriginal person, and it was quite a horrible thing. It was in Launceston, and it was in 1822 when 2 convicts, if I remember correctly, were executed for the rape of an Aboriginal woman back then. And so it was quite a horrible thing, and that's the only time anybody has ever been punished for a crime against. I might add, nobody was ever punished for the murdering or the killing of Aboriginal people. And remember, Tasmanian Aboriginal people were one of the largest traded human remains as well. So after we died, a lot of our skeletons were cut up and body parts were used, which is just a disrespectful way to treat a human being. And it kind of shows you that people didn't necessarily perceive us all that much as human beings when they were here. And that's something we're still getting to today. Now, I like to touch on this simply because so many people have heard of this place, but they don't know the context of this place. For example, my whole life, I've heard the name of this place mentioned from media and movies and TV everywhere around the world, because it's got some of the best steak you'll ever try. And that's this place here. The Van Diemen's Land Company has a place known as Cape Grim up in the northwest of Tasmania. And Cape Grim, it's called that because of a massacre that actually happened where the shepherds actually killed around about 30 women and children and threw them off the cliff face at Cape Grim, and hence the name. Now, that's why I like to tell the truth about it, because it is well known as today as this beautiful place where we can have this lovely produce, but it has a very dark history. And it was done by this company here, the Van Diemen's Land Company. And a lot of stuff I've pointed out in this exhibition was actually done by private companies. Yes, the British Empire was a part of this, but a lot of private companies came here. We had private shepherd companies. We had sealing and whaling companies coming to this land. So a lot of, it's a very complex history. There was both the government, there was the individual settlers, there was bushrangers going out who had escaped as convicts. There were convicts themselves who were given weapons and told to fight Aboriginal people. And then there's the private companies as well. It's a very complex history when it comes to the Van Diemen's Land conflict period, or the Van Diemen's Land war period. This is a part just to discuss and talk to Kikitapula, because he has one of the most contentious lives I think I've ever read about. Because a lot of people said he played both sides. He played the Aboriginal side, he played the European side. Who knows really? And you've got to really think about it. What's the trauma that that young man had inside of him? Stolen at the age of 10, brought up by Europeans, forced to learn their language, and then runs away at 22. You've got to think about the psychology of this young man and the trauma he's gone through, which then defines the things he would have done throughout his life. That's something we've got to remember when we look through history, is actually to remember psychology and to remember the mental health and the mental effects of a lot of things. Even nutrition. We've got to think of the diet that a lot of the people were eating. The British that came here were not having the best diet. They were eating bread and flour and sugar, things that actually make you quite sick compared to the old people who had some of the best food you've ever eaten. We had oysters, mussels, crayfish, abalone, kangaroos and wallaby almost every day. So healthy-wise, we were extremely healthy. So it's a thing to just think about. Just think about, being brought up like that with that beautiful diet until you're 10 years old, and then you get stolen, and then you're forced to eat European food. You've got to think about how that would affect both mentally and physically somebody. There's so many ways to look at this history. And it's a very, very complex history, and it's a very, very complex equation when we're getting into this. I myself am in fact a physical representation of this history. I only look like this because of what occurred. And I quite often use myself as an educational tool because I am a physical representation of the colonisation or invasion of what we know as Australia. And the very last thing I want to show you is an interactive we have in this exhibition, which is about perspective. And it's about perspective of Tasmanians, it is. Here's a list of kind of Tasmanians on this screen. This is interactive I want to actually get online so it can be utilised by all Tasmanians, by everybody. Because this was filmed in 2012. So this is the time where you actually see a snapshot where it's not about argument, it's just about, I'm a Tasmanian and I'm telling my perspective. We're not, and the way we ask questions, for example, I'll give you a question here. This is me many years ago, but I just want the question to come up. And the questions are really non-argumentative here. What happened in Tasmania after Europeans arrived? It's not after Europeans invaded, it's after they arrived. We intentionally made it non-combative because we just wanted people to just tell their honest opinions and the perspectives of all Tasmanians. And that's why we did this kind of story here. So it's really, really good to get the understanding of perspectives of both non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people. It is. And there's about 6 questions. And this is something that would be really, really good to kind of do in a classroom and delve into kind of the concept of perspective when in relation to conflict and warfare. It is. And just, you know, the respect of understanding this history and how if you don't understand it properly, it does have an effect. It does have a knock-on effect, you know. I've heard my whole life people say this and explain this history in a bad way. I myself was taught it of, well, we came and saved you guys. You know, we took your land, but then we gave you civilization. So it's all a matter of perspective. And that's what we've got to remember. Whenever you look at history, is to question it and think about it and use your own common sense. And that's the best way to understand this history. And to use some empathy as well, because it is to do with the heart. You've got to remember, you've got to be empathetic when you're looking at history, because a lot of it is to do with lots of trauma and a lot of very nasty stuff. So, yeah, try not to get caught up in all that. But thank you very much. And please, when we do reopen up for after the Corona era, please do come and utilise the parrawa exhibition, because it's an exhibition that can be very powerful, but it can also it can be quite painful as well. But it's worthwhile that we all understand the history of the country we live on, because it's the history of all of us. And it's worthwhile we all understand the history of the place we live within. And I'd just like to say a thank you to our sponsors at TasNetworks for helping us have the ability to do this here today. So thank you very much.